Good evening, everybody. I am Jeff Berardelli. I am CBS News meteorologist and climate specialist. And by the way, I am also an alumni of the Columbia Climate and Society program. And I am honored, very honored, and excited to moderate this important discussion tonight. Columbia, as you know, has been leading the way on climate change for quite a while. The university's Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory is a world-leading earth and climate research enterprise. The Earth Institute, for more than 25 years, has been expanding on the application of climate change science, bringing together experts from across the disciplines to tackle the climate change crisis in a myriad of ways, from climate to law to climate ethics and to food security. And now, this is exciting, Columbia is preparing to launch the Columbia Climate School, welcoming its first cohort of students in the fall. And tonight we'll be talking all about this with two of Columbia's top research leaders in climate change and earth science. Alex Halliday, founding dean of the Columbia Climate School and director of Columbia's Earth Institute, and Maureen Raymo, co-founding dean of the Climate School and director of the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. So first, let me welcome both of you to this discussion and say thank you very much for inviting me. I am just so honored to be a part of it. And I first wanted to get to know both of you and have our audience get to know both of you. So first of all, Maureen, I want to know what led you to take up this extraordinary research career and what landed you here at Columbia.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. And it's a pleasure to be here and just, again, really excited. This has been a very exciting week for us. So what led me to this time and place in my life? It started as a child, you know, a love of the outdoors and the ocean in particular. And I can't remember a time I didn't want to be an oceanographer and study the ocean. And in the late 70s in college, I ended up at a university where I fell in with a research group that was studying the history of Earth's climate using marine sediments. And I've never looked back from that point. I mean, it really defined the path of my career. And I've been studying Earth's climate and its history over time, and especially how it informs what's happening now ever since.
So I'm going to ask both you and Alex this question. So remember this question, which is, did you ever think you would be in this position? And what I mean by that is in the position that you and Alex and all folks in earth sciences and climate science are going to need to save the world now. So hold on, don't answer that, because I want to ask you, Alex, about your career, how you got started, what drew you to this field, and then we will answer that big question of, did you think you'd be in this position at this point?
So nice question, Jeff. I grew up in Cornwall in southwest England, and I was there as a teenager anyway. And I ended up getting very interested in Cornwall used to be, as well as being a very beautiful place, it also used to be the heart of the world's copper and tin production. So there are all these ruins around Cornwall from the mines, which are now pretty much all closed. But actually, I started collecting minerals with my aunt, and she sort of took me around there and showed me where I could get good stuff. And I got very interested in the whole subject of geology. And I decided I wanted to become a geologist so that I could get involved in mining geology and wanted to do something useful in the world. And I thought in those days, mining geology was pretty useful. And then at university, I ended up being sidetracked from my goal because I thought, well, I want to work on mineral deposits, but I had a chance to do a PhD in the physics department on isotopic dating of mineral deposits. And that got me into the whole field of isotopes and using isotopes to figure out how the history of the Earth works. I found it fascinating that you could figure out how old something was that was millions of years old, and actually figure out the chronology of what had happened to the planet. And so that took me down a path completely different from what I'd expected. And I ended up getting into areas about 25 years ago in this sort of diverse array of things that I've studied including stuff to do with ocean circulation and climate change. But it wasn't until I got to Oxford and then became Dean of Science and Engineering. I was on the council of the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK and the Natural History Museum in London, and later Vice President of the Royal Society, that I started realizing the urgency of moving us towards net zero and thinking about climate change more intensively. And so when Columbia approached me, I said, well, if you want me to work on this, then I am interested in doing it. And that's how I've ended up getting here today.
I find it interesting that most folks who get into science are interested in it from an early age. I've wanted to be a meteorologist since I'm 3 years old. And I found myself now in a situation where we on this earth are kind of fighting for, humanity and the health of our planet. And I can't imagine that either of the two of you would imagine you'd be in a position where, your careers as, in earth science have kind of ended up here.
Yeah, well,
Either one of you can take that question.
never in a million years would, even 2 years ago, the idea of Columbia building a climate school, was such an amazing idea to think about. And here we are 2 years later, and we're doing it, and it's really exciting. But it is funny just thinking about the big swath of the last few decades. In the 80s, when I was kind of coming of age as a scientist, I realized, oh yeah, climate is changing. The scientists knew the Earth was warming. And I'm like, people should be really interested in this and be worried about this. And then by the 90s, I was like, yeah, people should, this is great at cocktail parties. People are going to want to know all about what I'm doing. And then we got to like the 2000s and it just became a culture war almost. But it's really exciting to be right here, right now, in this moment where there seems to be so much engagement across our nation and certainly around the world on this problem, which has only gotten worse decade by decade by decade. And we're running out of time to deal with it.
It's funny you say cocktail party, because the moment when Columbia creates the climate school, no one can attend cocktail parties.
I know.
The Columbia Climate School. It is kind of ironic. Alex, I'm curious. So, it's a pivotal moment for climate action. Scientists all agree. We have essentially 10 years. They're very crucial to make some really big changes in society and the way that we use energy. The IEA came out with their 2021 outlook today, and they say that we're rebounding not only to, but possibly past energy consumption levels of 2019 this year. And that coal is set to go up 60% from last year, faster than renewables are going up. So how serious of a problem are we in right now? How urgent is the need for climate action?
Well, it's quite astonishing, because I think in the last few years, we've been people have got very excited about, the reduction in cost of solar, the reduction in cost of wind, and people scaling up renewables in a tremendous way. And of course, it is, and the news about different countries increasingly switching to renewables and no longer needing coal. It's fantastic news. And then you actually look at the real numbers, and because of what's happening in the world, people's prosperity is improving. They actually all want to get a car. They want to basically have a nice home. There's increasing energy use. There's a phenomenal relationship between GDP and the amount of energy we consume, GDP per person. And so that means that basically, as people get better off, and which of course we all want, living standards improve, people live for longer, we're actually looking at worsening the climate crisis. And at a time when we've got a greater fraction of renewables, the problem is that the total amount that we're looking at there in that fraction, the denominator, is actually going up all the time. We're using more and more energy, tremendous amounts of energy, and even coal is increasing, like you say. And so this is terrible news. It's kind of like we have great ideals about needing to, and the IPCC said we had to start right now and actually start reducing our carbon emissions right now, a couple of years ago. And actually we're going in completely the wrong direction. It's quite remarkable that all this progress, and we actually haven't made progress on that.
And they did mention in their report that it was mostly developing countries. Developed countries will reduce their energy consumption a little bit, but developing countries increasing their energy needs and doing it oftentimes with coal, kind of like you were just talking about. So tomorrow, the president is going to be having a climate summit. All 40 invitees, I understand, will actually be attending, which is wonderful. You know, he's going to probably announce some very proactive initiatives. Are you more optimistic? I don't think it's hard to be more optimistic than we were for the past few years or so, because things are moving much, much quicker, which is great. So are you more optimistic about climate action, considering the worldwide attention to climate change right now, and how engaged the Biden administration is? I'll ask both of you that question.
Shall I start? Okay. I'm like, as I alluded to before, I'm thrilled about this. This is like a breath of fresh air, not to mention scientific enlightenment in some ways on the part of the government. We are joining many other nations that have been giving this challenge very serious attention, the attention it demands for years now. And livelihoods, the economies of not just our nations, but our nation, but other nations, are really going to depend on the choices and the decisions that are being made now. And, you know, just to hark back to what you just said, we have incredibly high per capita consumption of energy. Other nations are consuming more as they grow. You know, from an economic perspective, any climate changes that are global are going to impact all of us. So we need to make the real investment, not only in kind of doing the lifestyle adjustments that really aren't going to be hard with the technology that's available, but also, you know, being a player in terms of influencing the economic development and strategies used by other countries as well. Because we're not in an isolated bubble. We're all in this together.
Alex?
I guess I would say, I mean, your question is, oh, am I optimistic or more optimistic? And of course, you have to be more optimistic. It's wonderful to see what the Biden administration is doing. It was great to hear the speeches and hear the word science used over and over again, and focus on trying to come up with scientific solutions to things. And at the same time, now they're sort of trying to roll this out. There are the tremendous challenges ahead. There are challenges that are to do with the kinds of things that we've been talking about, to do with the fact that developing countries need to actually increase the amount of energy consumption. But there's also the focus on rebuilding the economy. And so, and in particular, that's going to be an issue right the way around the world. How do you actually rebuild the economy in a way that actually keeps things clean and green, at the same time as people really just want to get energy and get jobs and all the rest of it. So I think this is a massive problem. It's a really, really, as they say, wicked problem, because you have to think about the complexities of the solutions. There are solutions. That's the good news. That's the reason to be optimistic. We can do this one way or another. There are complexities about it. We've got to think about the financial incentives. We've got to think about how we do regulation, but also we've got to think about it as a political problem that is going to be incredibly difficult to work on. Because ultimately we've got to win hearts and minds over this issue. We need to actually get people to say, this is sufficiently important. And that's why Earth Day is such an important commemoration, really, because just over 50 years ago, people said, we care about our planet. We really want to see something done about the way we're trashing the planet. And we want to actually, so it's kind of like humanity got a voice in this whole thing, which I do think is needed. And the politics has got to play into that. We've got to be able to communicate with people in a way that they recognize that this is their problem and these are going to be their solutions going forward. So I think there are massive challenges around that.
I just like to follow up on that. I think bringing up the original Earth Day is terrific. And that led to many regulations, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, that really addressed the obvious pollution that was all around us. You know, and right now the US is less polluted now than it was back then. And it's the same problem, only the CO2, you can't see it, you can't smell it. It's not fouling your rivers, but it's insidious and it's destructive and it's pollution, and we need to treat it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I want to talk about how Columbia can help kind of lead and also kind of ride this wave of awareness and engagement. How can Columbia help to kind of push the conversation and the policy forward? Because this is going to take everybody.
So I think it's quite fair to say that the climate school is a major initiative in that direction, primarily reflecting the vision of the president and the trustees of Columbia. They're aware that we are fantastically strong in climate, but given the scale of the challenge, Lee Bollinger wanted to know what else we could do. What is there more that we could actually do in terms of what we need for the future? And so this idea of a climate school took off after a lot of consultation across Columbia with every school. We discovered we had close to 1,000 researchers and staff working on climate and related sustainability issues across Columbia. So it's a massive, if you like, powerhouse of expertise. Much of it, of course, is at Lamont, where Mo is. But at the same time, that's the kind of power you need to bring to the problem. You need to bring not just a lot of people, but a breadth of people who can understand things from the human point of view, human reactions and decision-making and thoughts about sociology, as well as people who are coming up with technology solutions in engineering, for example, or people who are thinking about how we're going to need to adapt from the point of view of infrastructure, or how we need to adapt in terms of the health crises that are going to be. So that's the kind of complexity of the problem. And that's why a university is the right place to tackle this issue, because it's got that academic breadth. It doesn't have to be Columbia. We happen to be very strong in this subject, but it needs to be that kind of an organization where you have that kind of academic breadth of know-how. And that's why universities are ramping up their efforts to engage more and really harness this intellectual firepower to attack the problem more effectively. And if we can do this, we need to track, not just tackle the issues of how do we come up with clever new technologies that will make a difference, but also how do we actually see this through a social justice lens, and how do we actually get people and communities to be carried along with the solution as we take it forward. So that's the vision of the climate school, to actually take the research. It's kind of more like a medical school where you've got a clinic and you've got doctors who are actually treating patients. It's our job, I think, to be more than just great researchers and great educators. Our job is also to try and provide something that will really connect with society and help society transition.
Yeah, and part of that is training the next generation of leaders in all aspects of the arts and the sciences, in governance and law and business. And the old ways of doing business are going to be replaced with new ways of doing business, and we need leaders and trained in that.
It amazes me when I look at climate change. I like to call it almost an octopus with tentacles. It seems to have its tentacles in everything. And now that I'm a meteorologist still, but now I have the training from Columbia University, from the Climate and Society program. I'm out there doing climate change. And boy, what an expansive field this is. 1 minute, I'm talking about the political ramifications of climate change on CBS. The next minute, I'm talking about tipping points. The next minute, I'm talking about why maybe there's some more tornadoes in the deep south. I mean, it is just so expansive. And I love the fact that Columbia is first to this, to creating a climate school with so much history. Wally Broker, James Hansen, all the great scientists that have passed through these doors. It is wonderful to see Columbia do it with the amount of resources that are available to Columbia and the great scientists. How do you tackle such a big problem in a way where you train the people of tomorrow to be able to confront how multidisciplinary this really is?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point. I mean, the masters that you took, Climate and Society, has now been moved to the climate school. It's going to be our first program. Our first students are arriving in the fall, and typically we used to get, I'm not sure how many there were, Jeff, when you did it, how many students there were. Typically we're getting numbers like 40 or 50. This year we've got close to 100. And so—
Well, let me interrupt you for a second, because we had about 15 or 20.
Okay.
So it's going up exponentially. And if there are any mathematicians on here, please don't do the math on what I just said. But
No.
you know what I mean, right?
Absolutely. But there's huge interest. And of course, the young people are tremendously engaged. The students at Columbia are, there's one of the great things about Columbia is, of course, the students themselves. Not the academics may be brilliant, but the students are energized, enthusiastic, care passionately about this. But we realize that what we have to do in part is to provide a cross-disciplinary education that includes natural sciences and social sciences, for example, which is what Climate and Society Master's Program does. We also need to, I think, build up know-how in communication, because a lot of the climate problem in terms of getting people to, to address the climate crisis is one of communication and getting people on board. And you're a brilliant example of this, Jeff, where you've gone out and actually become a communicator, a climate communicator. A lot of it is around how do we get people who aren't hearing the stories, people who aren't reading the New York Times, people who are reading actually a lot of other stuff, to actually understand the severity of the issue going forward. And so at some level, that's got to be part of the training of people coming out of Columbia as well. A lot of stuff around communication, leadership skills. So there's sort of things that you wouldn't normally think of as part of an education, but we also want to think about how can we provide that support for their career development going forward.
I couldn't agree with you more. Trying to wrap my head around how to communicate this and get to people who are really tough to get to, especially in this day and age where everything is about political predisposition and ideology. It is so tough. I actually got back from Eastern Kentucky to visit a coal mine that had closed and an old, former coal worker. And I think if we're going to make progress on climate communication, we have to really understand and sympathize and empathize with a lot of these folks who feel like they've been left behind. So that's something I'm trying to tackle as well. And remember, my background is I'm a TV weather person / meteorologist. So these are the kind of challenges that are facing climate communicators as we go forward. I'm glad I have the background from Climate Society, because it is so multidisciplinary for a problem, a challenge, a crisis that deserves that. I figured we can expand this conversation out just a bit to perhaps finance. There's a lot of financial aspects to climate change. The Fed is finally going to probably take some action on climate change. We see divestment happening all over the world right now. It seems that corporations and banks are starting to get the message. Is that where we need to, and I'll start with Maureen, is that where we need to put the pressure right now? The pocketbook, if you will, voting with our wallets to try to get things to move faster?
Well, first, I should say, finance is not my area of specialty. It's mud at the bottom of the ocean. But I look around and I see what's happening, and it really makes me optimistic, because, I've always thought about this problem as it's beyond science right now. There's so much scientific research we need to do, but it's a problem that's bigger than that. It's all hands on deck. And, I'll let Alex speak to, the global economic market, but people ask me all the time, what can I do? And one of the things I say is, besides educating yourself on the issue and voting for, the change you want to see in the world, the biggest thing you can do is kind of, think about how you spend your money. I believe that in the power of the purse. I believe that consumers can demand products, and the market will shift to give them what they want. So, everybody, fundamentally, climate change is a problem of consumption. And, you know, every time we buy, we should ask ourselves, do I need this? Is this the best I could buy of this? Am I planning to dispose of it? Or should I, you know, make it myself? Or I don't know. Anyway, but these are all, I think we're at a time and a place where these kind of lifestyle questions people should like interrogate themselves and ask, what role can I play in this as well? But it's not a role that's going to be solved by an individual changing their light bulbs, or, you know, even not eating beef, for instance. And I don't want people to feel guilty because they decide not to do one thing or not the other. It really does require everybody, and it's going to require governments and the corporate sector to engage. But if everybody engages, we can turn the ship, we can turn the Titanic away from the iceberg.
I think building on that, it's actually a really good point. There are a whole lot of issues around where we can, like if you take a company needs money, it needs finance. And so, you know, a company can decide what it's going to do in part based on, you know, where it needs to get resources from to actually expand and all the rest of it. And the banks have a major role in actually applying, and they have been applying pressure in that area. And I think that's access to capital. And we've seen this with BlackRock and a number of other companies, the Bank of England, of course. You know, there's been a big push to focus on thinking about where your investments are, what companies to invest in, and how do you actually think about this in terms of the security of your assets going forward, and whether these things are going to be actually reliable investments going forward. But I mean, it's also the people who actually work in the company have their own views about climate change. And they probably, you know, as they might want to say, we want our company to do different stuff from this. The people who buy the products, as Mo was saying, they can play a major role and say, we're not going to stand for this anymore. We want this to be different going forward. I think that the struggle, of course, is when you say to somebody, you know, as happened in our building in New York, the gas went out, and now they've got to take all the, you know, if we're going to do something green for the future, we might as well take out all the gas and replace it with electricals, which are going to come from renewables going forward. And of course, everybody then says, well, actually, I like cooking with gas. It's much easier than cooking with electricals. And so there are these lifestyle changes that people have got to come to terms with, which actually aren't going to be the kinds of things you feel positive about. They're going to be kind of things that maybe you feel quite negative about. And how are we going to deal with those? So I do think that creating the right kind of incentives for society to change is partly around the financial issues and getting investment in the right kind of technologies and the exciting new green tech that's coming out, clean tech that's coming out going forward. It's partly about making sure we don't have investments in stranded assets that are going to be problematic going forward. But it's also partly about the need to actually think about the human factor and how that's going to work. I would say that one of the things we're building in the climate school quite aggressively right now is a program on executive education, which is designed particularly, it was fostered already at Lamont by Alliance Bernstein getting in touch with Lamont scientists, saying we'd actually like to find out a bit about climate science and provide education for our own executives and business people and investors. And so they've actually got that going. It's brilliant. It's just been announced. It's being rolled forward in a fairly big way. And we've got about 10 other companies now saying they want to provide training as well for the colleagues in their companies. So there's opportunity there. And then we're also thinking about ways in which climate finance could become a fairly important portion of the climate school, not the main portion, but an important portion, which we're doing with the business school, which will involve a variety of education programs as well. So there are these opportunities around how the climate school in particular, I think, will tackle this. And of course, we're in New York City. I mean, it's the best city in the world. I can say that now I've left the UK. It's the greatest city in the world. And also it's the heart of the hub of the world in terms of finance. So if you can't do it here, you know, then you're failing to some extent. We should be able to make things happen here that connects to finance in particular.
So speaking of finance, some of the world's wealthiest philanthropists, they've announced ways to explore how to invest to help solve the climate crisis. So where do you think those resources should be, best applied to help the climate situation, Alex?
Well, I guess I'm in danger of going on too long, so you need to interrupt me on this. I think there are three big areas I can think of, and of course, they're all areas the climate school is thinking of. But the first one, I think, is around the areas of communication and education, that we actually do need to provide better ways of informing people, whether it's the public, whether it's students, whether it's executives, whether it's governments. So we need to set up constructs that will facilitate that communication. Communication is going to be massively important going forward. And I think we've got to get that bit right. And so getting support for that from philanthropy, I think, would be immensely helpful, in particular in dealing with kids and school kids, but the teachers as well, and getting them to understand what the future looks like and how we can help train people going forward. So I think that's really important. And of course, there's also the misinformation that you've got to deal with. You want to have a slicker way of dealing with this than we typically have today. And the second thing I think that's really important for philanthropy is to think about ways in which you can really put money behind slightly crazy ideas. Those things that are actually, you're not going to get funded through a National Science Foundation because they're slightly untested, they're very novel, they're very risky, but boy, could they make a big difference if they turn out to be right. And that's the kind of thing where I think philanthropists have thought that actually that could make a significant difference that's different from what the kinds of normal funding. And we need those big ideas right now to tackle the climate problem. But the third area that I think is massively important is that where philanthropy could play a huge role is that climate change is going to have a massive impact on certain communities and underprivileged communities, typically in the South, of course. And we need to think about how that's going to be supported going forward. There are huge numbers of issues around adaptation, but also thinking about the social justice issues. How do we provide a framework of legal representation of climate refugees, which don't exist at the moment? We have people who are refugees from war, and that's recognized by the UN, but what will happen? How do we set that context for what's going to be happening in the future? How do we think about the impact on children and who are growing up in areas that are going to be devastated by climate change? There are going to be generations, there are going to be mass migrations. We're going to have to think about refugees and the impact they have on society more broadly. These are massive problems that are typically not so well funded as concepts by, like, Federal Department of Energy doesn't do that, NSF doesn't do much of that. But these are sort of the big things that I think we need to be thinking about in terms of adaptation and how do we get society prepared for the ravages of climate change going forward. At Columbia, I am going on slightly more. At Columbia, 20 years ago, a famous scientist, Mark Kane, and his student figured out how to predict El Nino, and they used that modeling. And of course, they established the Climate and Society program as a result of that. They used that to take that science and actually use it to warn societies around the world what would happen in their own countries in the succeeding years. And that became an incredibly good example of taking the science of Lamont and really putting it to work in helping society in a major way. And to some extent, we need to do the same kind of thing with providing climate services to the world right now around the impacts of longer term climate change and extreme events that we're going to start to see more and more of going forward. I should stop.
Maureen, I'm curious how you see your role and the role of science in the new Columbia Climate School. I spent most of my day yesterday writing a story and preparing for a climate tipping points segment that I'm going to be doing. And almost all the experts I spoke to said that what they might have thought was far off and distant 1 or 2 decades ago, now they start to see is something that could actually happen. West Antarctica is an example of that. The Amazon rainforest transitioning to a savanna, another example. So I'm curious, where you see the science going and how Columbia Climate School can play a big role in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, all the questions that we're discussing right now are all related in so many ways. For instance, the need for funding and philanthropy is so great in so many areas. As leader of Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory and now the Emerging Climate School, I mean, I am absolutely committed to the importance of basic research. The basic research leads to kind of use-inspired science. It leads to engineered solutions that can remove carbon dioxide. We have scientists studying the mineralization reactions in lab reaction vessels in our labs that reactions that maybe we can scale up to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We need to better understand how marine and terrestrial ecosystems are going to respond to climate and sea level change. We have scientists studying the risks associated with extreme events such as storms, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis. How do you quantify and predict risk and help communities, especially vulnerable communities, prepare, react, and adapt to them, manage those risks? You mentioned the West Antarctic ice sheet. I mean, we have one of the world's leading polar research groups, and studying polar ice sheets at both poles. And it's both scary and exciting at the same time how little we understand the poles. And it's an incredibly challenging and expensive and place to work. Just the logistics of working at the poles are extraordinary. And we need
cold. But not as
kind of person, right? There's the earth scientists that study coral reefs in the tropics, and then there's the
I'd like to be one of those.
But we need to be tackling this problem from every angle. So the beauty of the climate school is we have incredible rock solid foundation in the basic sciences, and we're not going to walk away from that. What's my role? You asked. Trying to find resources for our scientists, trying to be alert to the exciting emerging problems and how we contribute to solutions on those. So it's going to be a fun challenge. And I can speak on behalf of all the scientists that work at Lamont, for instance, and at IRI and at Season. They're all passionate. They're passionate about helping to solve this problem and helping to create the knowledge that will help us solve this problem.
It's an exciting time to be a climate scientist. It's an exciting time to be where you are and where we all are right now.
Yeah.
So, I want to, in a couple of seconds, turn this over to questions, but I do have one more question for Alex, which is, I know you always like to ask the guests to consider if there's one takeaway from this particular discussion that you would want people to kind of walk away with after this discussion. What would that takeaway be?
I think the main well, let me just frame it first, that as a geoscientist studying the history of the Earth, I think about climate change in the context of how this has changed just over the last 1% of the history of the Earth, which is going back 45 million years. When 45 million years ago, there were no ice sheets. There was vastly more CO2 in the atmosphere, more like 1,000 parts per million. And we had temperatures that were several degrees Celsius of warming. And we don't know what it's like to be in that situation. If you remove the ice sheets today, sea level would go up by about 200 feet. It's huge. It's a massive problem, and that's the kind of the scale of the problem. And you say, well, that's going to take ages. It is. It's going to take a long time. But that's the path that the Earth is setting itself on right now to move towards that condition and try and equilibrate to these high levels of CO2. The last time we had just 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere was 3 million years ago. And at that time, there was no northern hemisphere glaciation. And at that time, we had sea levels that were about more than 20 meters above today, or 60 feet above today. So this is a massive problem we're facing going forward. And we're going to have to think quite hard about this. And, Mo has waxed lyrical, and rightly so, about the strength of Lamont and the science. But this is a massive policy challenge as well. And we need to, in building the climate school, we need to be figuring out what kind of policies do we need to solve this really, really hard problem. And that is so scary and such an existential threat for society, and yet needs such careful handling to get people to transform the way they're behaving today in such a totally radical way that will allow decarbonization and a transition to a safe world going forward. So that's my rather long take-home message, yes.
Yeah, we got a big challenge ahead of us, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But lots of opportunity, and that's why I'm encouraged by Biden's approach, in that he realizes connecting climate to jobs, people knowing that there's going to be opportunities for them to help, not only for them to prosper, hopefully, but also help. And I think that's where communication comes in, right? Being able to communicate to people that there are opportunities in climate change. And in fact, the mine workers union, I think you probably saw this within the last couple of days, said that they are warming up and they agree with some of Biden's policies because they realize that it can bring some meaningful jobs to coal country. So that is a tremendous, think about that. That is a tremendous step in the right direction. But as you've said, Alex, communication is such a vital part of it. And I know that it's important to you to bring that to the Columbia Climate School. So with all that said, we have a bunch of questions coming in. So let me just read the first question. All right. Maureen, what are the solutions that most excite or encourage you right now?
Oh, that's a hard question, actually. I'm really like you. I'm very excited about what's happening in the Biden administration. I do believe that we need something equivalent to a Green New Deal, which was like the last New Deal, which put people back to work in new and different ways and built incredible infrastructures that, still carry our nation forward to today. We need new ways to deal with electricity and getting it around to places where it needs to be. I'm excited about the research that's going on about trying to figure out ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And I have to preface that by saying it can't be the whole solution. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but people have to understand that when we put the CO2 in the atmosphere, it's staying there. It's not magically disappearing as we reduce our consumption. So it's just going to be part of a very multifaceted solution that we're going to need. One other thing that I should say is before we even kind of really dug into planning the climate school, we commissioned a market analysis of would there be jobs if we trained hundreds of students in climate science and climate policy and climate governance, and there was. I mean, the report came back that this was a growing and a rapidly growing area. And so that makes me optimistic again, that as companies pivot to understand how can they create products that are more sustainable and friendlier to the planet.
How about you, Alex? What are the solutions that most excite you?
Well, I think carbon removal is one of the most exciting technological challenges, so I think I agree with Mo there. I think that it's not just that it's interesting, it's a really interesting piece of chemistry, physical chemistry that you've got to come up with to make this work and do it at a level that's economic, and then figure out how to take all that carbon dioxide and put it, where we're looking at the moment, roughly 50 gigatons equivalent of CO2 in the atmosphere every year. Those are the emissions. That's the stuff we've got to get rid of. It's a huge amount, and it's comparable to the amount of stuff we actually move around in oil and gas pipelines every year. So this is a huge chunk of stuff, a technological challenge like we've never seen before, to actually not just get the stuff out of the atmosphere, but get it out at scale and then actually start to transport it and bury it out at sea safely. And a lot of that work was pioneered at Lamont, and we've still got work going on in that area. But now people are thinking about it. Exxon's just come out with an idea about it. There's lots of interest in this as a problem, which I think is also quite interesting because it actually brings the oil and gas industry and makes them part of the solution, because we don't know how to do this. And they're the people who really know how to move that stuff around. So I think those are the kinds of things that strike me as very interesting, very innovative, still really hard. But if you look at the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, all of the solutions that get you there basically require that we do this negative emission technology and take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so while it's too small at the moment to be effective, to remove anything like the amounts that we need to remove, and it's also too expensive, we need to find a way to make it cheaper and scale it up. And I think that'll be a game-changing thing for the planet.
Coincidentally, I actually am in the midst of writing a carbon capture and direct air capture story right now. And that'll be publishing tomorrow, and I'll be on CBSN talking about it. And I interviewed Julio Friedman for that particular Carbon Wrangler, which I love that. I just love that handle, and that is in the story because I love the handle. So anyway, just to give you an idea of what your students are doing, which is a lot of stuff once they get out in the world and get jobs. So how about a carbon tax? That's an interesting one, right? Because it's gone back and forth. 1 minute it's in vogue, the next minute it's not in vogue anymore. So what are your thoughts on a carbon tax and also carbon offsets, which are so great and at the same time so controversial? I saw something on Bloomberg.com today about a story. I don't know if you guys had a chance to see it, but about how valid are they really? They pose a real challenge, don't they?
Yeah. I mean, do you want me to have a go at that, Mo?
Yeah, you have a go at that one.
Okay, so I think the carbon tax idea is a really important idea, and again, Columbia has been the Center for Global Energy Policy, headed up by Jason Bordoff, put together a really important, worked with members of Congress last couple of years ago, trying to work with the Republicans in particular to get the idea of this out there. And of course, it got voted down, but nonetheless, the idea is out there, and eventually people will end up saying, actually, maybe a carbon tax isn't such a bad idea. There's quite a lot of push against it. There's been businesses have been pushing against it, of course, the oil and gas industry. And at the same time, I think ultimately people might say this actually might be a good way to go. The difficulty about it, I think, is that at some level, some of these incentives that can be quite complicated to actually enact. You think maybe the best thing is just to say, forget it. Let's just regulate the whole thing and actually come up with a different way of trying to control the amount of carbon dioxide that we're utilizing and bring in regulation on carbon footprint more than actually using a tax. The carbon, I think the one thing I would say that right now looks particularly interesting, though, is the European Green Deal, which is where they're talking about putting a carbon tax on imports, which is, I think, transformational. If you actually are a business that's used to, some part of the world, used to exporting a ton of stuff to Europe, and suddenly you realize that there's going to be a tax put on this stuff, that could make you think seriously about how you change your ways of production and actually start to decarbonize your manufacturing. I don't want to belittle it. I mean, I think decarbonizing manufacturing is it's almost like one of the big elephants in the room that people haven't tackled properly yet. It's a huge area, I think, of research growth that is needed because it's so very, very difficult to do, whether it's cement or whether it's steel or whatever it is. Decarbonizing manufacturing is, I think, really a difficult thing to do. But I think this will force people to think about how do we do that and actually avoid these carbon taxes. So I think the European carbon tax is actually a very, very interesting driver of change, a border tax. Rather like you, offsets, I've never really felt terribly convinced that they really are that effective in terms of really reducing carbon emissions that much. They're quite hard to be
Verify.
clear about how effective they really are.
Maureen, do you want to jump into this?
Well, I don't know a lot about this area, but I do know that I and everyone do not pay the full cost of the energy and the products and the gas we use, right? It's like we get to use the carbon-based fuel, but we don't have to pay for the safe disposal of the waste that goes along with the consumption of that fuel. So any ways you can try to put a true value on the destruction that is associated with the consumption of fossil fuels and somehow work that into the economic system. I mean, I just hope they find a way to do that, because it's not really right the way it is now.
So kind of switching topics a little bit, someone did ask, can you speak to some of the curriculum in the climate school? Who would be the right fit to apply to these programs?
Well, the programs are being developed, and it's actually incredibly exciting talking about where we're going in committees, and Alex has probably been in even twice the number of committees that I've been on this. But as he said earlier in this hour, there's 1,000 people across Columbia University who in every single school and department who is doing some scholarly study that intersects with climate and the changes that climate is having on this world, from arts to architecture to business. So, I would say anybody could potentially come into the climate school. There's really, and you said this before too, there's almost no facet of society anymore that climate doesn't influence.
Maybe I could just quickly add that, in doing this work on trying to figure out who's interested in climate, we found that, like I say, even dentistry is interested in climate change. The School of Nursing is interested in climate change. They all see it as something really important going forward they want to get into. And the humanities, the fine arts, there's tons of it, So the level of engagement across Columbia, actually and across New York, has been amazing in terms of just talking about this subject. And so you think, well, what are the possible educational offerings that you might provide in those different contexts? And of course, there are actually lots of ideas about things we could do. The historians say they actually, they could actually almost hire every history professor, new history hire could be at the interface between history and climate change, the impact climate has had on history, which they think is such a really interesting area right now. And so this is a subject that's going everywhere. And the school, in principle, working with these various subjects across Columbia, can come up with a very rich tapestry of amazing educational offerings. But it's building on a lot of stuff that's already there. And so the business school does stuff. Of course, the Mailman School of Public Health does a whole lot of work in this area. The architecture school, they all basically bring climate change into the curriculum. And as the climate school is getting going, they're saying, well, what else could we do? And so there's a ramping up of effort across Columbia. And if anybody does particularly want to find out about where to go, what kind of subjects there are available, we're bringing that capability so that we can actually triage this centrally and provide advice to students who are interested in studying climate to go in various directions. But in terms of the Climate and Society program that you took, I mean, the purpose of it is to take a mixture of people who come from non-science background and science background and provide them with what they need to be strong in both sciences and social sciences going forward. But the humanities want to do stuff in this space as well. There's going to be tons of opportunities, I think, in terms of different subject areas.
Sounds like your biggest challenge is going to be figuring out what not to put in the curriculum, because there's so much that you can do.
Well, I mean, there's a good point to raise there, and that is that while everybody's focusing on increasing the climate content, there are some, master's programs we are specifically going to design with different parts of the university, which I think could be particularly helpful. You could, for example, come up with a degree in a master's in climate and journalism. That might seem like a good idea. So there are a variety of things that we've been thinking about like that we could put together. But we're also thinking about how do we take the climate and masters in society and the masters in climate and society and actually turn it and actually maybe develop something bigger that actually might be a slightly more intense degree program. At the moment, the Masters in Climate and Society is just 12 months. So the idea is we might make something that's a bit more intense that would go on for a bit longer, which would allow more of a deep dive into the heart of some of the issues that are involved. So that's the big program we're working on right now in the background.
I'm glad I'm missing the intense because, I actually became a student again 20-something years after I was a student the first time around in my early 40s. So intense wasn't what I was looking for at that time. I was just trying to learn how to learn again, if you will. I have an interesting question from one of the folks who are watching this right now. This person says, I teach high school earth science. Other than the greenhouse effect, what are the most important big picture subjects for students to understand about climate change? Maureen, what do you think about that?
Well, high school earth science, that's awesome. In addition to the greenhouse effect, I put that in the context of understanding Earth's climate history, why there are ice ages, how man-made climate change intersects with natural climate change. I would think it'd be really important to talk about global warming and how we know the world is warming and what's the data sets behind that, what the ramifications of the warming that's already happened have been for sea level, for ecosystems, the contributions of deforestation, both and reforestation to the balance of CO2 in the atmosphere, and what are our likely projections and what do those projections depend on? Do they depend on natural causes or do they depend on the actions of societies and communities? It's such a fascinating subject. Obviously, I could talk about it forever. So
I think increasingly people also want to look at, people are thinking about how to teach about energy and get people to think about that energy balance and how it works. And so, because, there's a lot of hype out there about decarbonization and the average citizen maybe doesn't know quite what to make of all of this stuff, whether it's renewables or whatever it is. So understanding how energy works just in a very simple way, I think, and a lot of it's fairly straightforward sums and maths, the balance is something I think would be immensely valuable. And actually everyone needs to know that, I think, at a level better than maybe they've been taught in the past. So I think just understanding how energy works could be really helpful.
That's totally right too. And just understanding all the different forms of energy and how they're emerging and how they're growing and changing the landscape. Case studies of a town that's decided to go from gas-based to wind-based energy sources. I mean, there's so many great stories out there right now about how the world is pivoting to a more sustainable future. Yeah. And those stories make you optimistic about the future.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. And speaking of optimism, I'm so optimistic because the youth really care about this issue. And they care about this issue rightfully so, because this is going to most affect them. Their children. But it is so wonderful to see them engaged and interested in it. They are helping to bring on this revolution, this big change that we need to turn this ship around. So it is, I think, so great to see the youth involved, interested in everything. They're very intrigued, young folks today. So with that said, I think we only have about a minute or two left. So I just wanted to ask you for closing statements. Why don't we start with you, Maureen?
Oh boy, I feel like you just put me on the spot.
Oh, sorry about that. How about I put Alex on the spot first and then you after him? He's thinking because I saw his eyes go up to the ceiling. So, right, I caught you thinking. So, Maureen, we're gonna let Alex, and then I'll come back to you. Okay.
Okay.
I think okay, so my closing thought, I guess, would be, that climate change is a really, really hard problem. It's a problem that's the biggest intergenerational human rights issue we face. And people, we're not just thinking about it in the context of us and whether it's interesting and fascinating and what we need to do in terms of profits, losses, inconveniences. It's the thing that's going to really impact grandchildren and great-grandchildren going forward. And what kind of a world do we want to leave for those people? It's something where the science is still unfolding. And it's really important to recognize that people over the years have picked holes in the uncertainty of the science. And because there are uncertainties around it. And part of that uncertainty is that as the climate is changing, we're getting to see new phenomena, which we just didn't know about, like Hurricane Harvey, where suddenly you have this massive, the hurricane slows down, dumps a lot of water, the increased amounts of wildfire, things like this, the kind of new phenomena. So there are these phenomena that are trying to be understood, and that science needs to be, well supported and thought about. And it's fascinating, but people who just sort of pick holes in what we don't know really aren't helping the problem. What you need to focus on is the scale of the problem that we're heading towards, based on partly paleoclimate records, and partly the fact that things are getting worse rather than better in terms of emissions, and partly in the case of, from the context of what we need to do going forward, needing to be quite drastic. So it's a really hard problem, but it's going to affect not us so much as it will affect younger people and future generations. And we've got to think about that from the point of view of equity, quite apart from the social justice issues of which communities are both going to be more affected than others. So I think that's the way to think about it in my final perspective. This is a problem for the future that we need to think about.
Well, I could not agree more, Alex. You were such an inspiring leader of the climate school. You inspire me every day. So given that that's a hard act to follow, I will just say happy Earth Day to everybody. And I wish you an hour to get out in nature tomorrow and think about this discussion, and just think about it's the mothership out there. We got to take care of it.
I agree. I
And
agree.
thank you, Jeff.
Oh, my pleasure. And again, like I said, I'm honored and again, a little jealous that I did not get to participate and be a student at the Columbia Climate School. But it really is, I'm very excited. When I heard the announcement, I was really excited because I thought it was exactly what was needed right now at this very moment. So I want to thank everybody, Alex, Maureen, and everybody who's here watching and participating, and thank you for all the questions. As you can tell, I'm a big believer in the power of Columbia's Earth Institute and all of the climate programs. I'm really excited about the Columbia Climate School. All of this, Columbia has really helped to shape my career, make me who I am today, and help me to communicate, what is a very challenging field to communicate. So on behalf of Columbia, I want to thank all the donors who support the Earth Institute and make programs just like this lecture series very possible. And I'd also like to ask you to consider supporting this important work on all fronts to help shape the climate crisis going forward and help solve it by making a gift to the Earth Institute if it is all possible. I want to wish you a terrific day, and I want to encourage you to check out my latest articles and my latest productions for CBS News as well. And again, thank you so much for joining us here. It's been a great night and a really great discussion.